Marcus Whitfield had just closed the biggest deal of his career. 6 months of negotiation, 3 rejected proposals, and 1 moment in a conference room in Chicago where the client finally said yes. He walked out of that building into the cold October air and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not relief, not even pride exactly. Something closer to arrival. He had made it, and that feeling, the one that tells you the hard part is over, is the exact moment when most people quietly begin to lose. Not because they get lazy, not because they stop caring, but because the human brain treats success as a signal to stand down. The tension that sharpened their instincts for months finally releases, and in that release, something dangerous happens. They stop checking the very things that got them there. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever done this? Landed the promotion, hit the number, closed the deal, and then, without ever deciding to, simply stop paying the same kind of attention you were paying the week before? Marcus didn't notice it happening. Nobody ever does. That's what makes it so effective as a trap. It doesn't arrive as failure. It arrives as comfort. And comfort, unlike failure, never announces itself. For the next few weeks, Marcus kept doing what had worked. He used the same pitch structure. He trusted the same instincts. He assumed that whatever had gotten him into that room in Chicago would keep getting him into rooms like it. This is where the story of almost every person who plateaus actually begins, not with a mistake, but with an assumption. The quiet, unspoken belief that the method that worked once will keep working simply because it worked once. But here is what almost nobody realizes about this. The conditions that made a strategy successful are almost never permanent. The market shifts, the competition adjusts. The client who said yes for one set of reasons might say no to the same pitch 6 months later, for reasons that have nothing to do with effort and everything to do with change. Marcus never bothered to track. Think about that for a moment. Most people believe complacency looks like laziness, sleeping in, coasting, doing less, but that is rarely how it actually shows up in high performers. Complacency in ambitious people looks like repetition. It looks like doing the same disciplined, effective thing over and over with total confidence, long after the world around that thing has quietly changed. It looks like success, right up until it doesn't. This is the part of the pattern that separates 2 types of people who both experience real wins. Type 1 treats a win as proof that they've figured something out permanently. Type 2 treats a win as one data point, gathered under a specific set of conditions that may never repeat exactly the same way again. The first type stops asking questions. The second type asks more of them, right when it would be easiest to stop. There is a particular kind of person, and you likely already know one, even if you've never put language to it, who seems to get sharper after success rather than softer, who treats a great quarter not as a finish line, but as new information to be examined, who sits with a win for an evening, maybe even celebrates it properly, and then the next morning asks a question that most people would find almost paranoid. What made this work? And will it still work next time? That question is not born from insecurity. It is born from respect for how quickly conditions change and how rarely anyone tells you when they have. Marcus didn't ask that question after Chicago. He didn't ask it after the next deal either, a smaller one that came almost too easily and reinforced everything he already believed. It wasn't until the third pitch, the one that fell apart in a way he couldn't quite explain, that something in him started to itch with a discomfort he hadn't felt in months. He would later describe that moment as the first time he noticed the alarm. Not a loud one, not the kind that forces you to act, a quiet one, easy to sleep through if you're not listening for it, the kind that only ever goes off in the space between success and the next test, a space most people fill with confidence instead of curiosity. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because the instinct to relax after winning isn't a character flaw. It's a design feature of the human nervous system, built for a world where threats were physical and finite, not economic, competitive, and constantly evolving. Understanding that isn't an excuse, it's the beginning of doing something about it, because there is a specific kind of person who has learned to work against that design on purpose, who has built a habit so counterintuitive that most people never even consider it, let alone practice it deliberately. They reassess when things are going well, not when something breaks, not when a client walks away or a number drops or a warning sign finally becomes impossible to ignore. They do it while everything still looks fine, while the applause is still fresh, while every external signal says there is nothing to fix. And that single habit, practiced quietly and consistently, tends to separate the people who have one good year from the people who have one good decade. Marcus didn't know it yet, standing in that Chicago cold with his phone buzzing with congratulations, but he was about to learn the difference between winning once and knowing how to keep winning. And the lesson would not come from another success. It would come from watching one slip through his hands. The third pitch fell apart on a Tuesday. Marcus had walked in expecting what he'd come to expect. Nodding heads, easy rapport, the particular rhythm of a room that was already leaning toward yes. Instead, he got questions he hadn't prepared for. Pushback on numbers he assumed were bulletproof. A silence at the end of his closing statement that he would replay in his head for weeks afterward, trying to understand exactly where it had gone wrong. He didn't get the deal. What stung wasn't the loss itself. Losses happen to everyone, even the best. What stung was the confusion. He had done everything the same way, same structure, same tone, same confidence that had worked twice before, and this time it hadn't landed at all. This is the moment that reveals something most people never fully examine about their own success: the difference between a strategy and a streak. A strategy is something you understand well enough to adjust when conditions change. A streak is something that works until, without warning, it doesn't, and you're left with no idea why. Most people, if they're honest with themselves, have been riding a streak and calling it a strategy at some point in their lives. It feels the same from the inside. The results are similar. The confidence is identical, but one of them has a shelf life you can't see coming, and the other one grows sharper with every use. Marcus had assumed Chicago proved something permanent about how he pitched. In reality, it proved something true about one room, one client, one moment in time. He had mistaken a single successful outcome for a repeatable formula, and nobody around him had any reason to correct that assumption. Why would they? From the outside, he looked like a man on a winning streak. Only he could feel that something underneath it had quietly stopped fitting. Here is what almost nobody realizes about this. Success is often the worst teacher, precisely because it removes the pressure to keep learning. Failure forces reflection. It demands an explanation. But success lets you walk away without asking a single question, because the outcome already told you what you wanted to hear. This is why so many talented, driven people plateau, not despite their early wins, but because of them. The win becomes the story they tell themselves about who they are and how they operate, and that story hardens into identity long before it's actually tested against changing conditions. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever explained a success using a reason that felt true, but that you never actually verified? That unverified explanation becomes a kind of quiet inheritance. You carry it forward into every future decision, treating it as settled fact when it was really just a guess that happened to be followed by a good outcome. Over time, layers of these unverified explanations stack on top of each other, and you end up operating on a foundation you've never actually inspected. Marcus began, almost by accident, to inspect his. He pulled up his notes from the Chicago pitch and the second deal that followed it, and he started asking a question he hadn't asked in months. Not what happened, but why. specifically mechanically, without the flattering narrative he'd already built around his own instincts. What he found unsettled him. The two wins hadn't come from the same source at all. Chicago had closed because of timing and a competitor's recent failure that had nothing to do with him. The second deal had closed because of a genuine relationship he'd built over a year, not the pitch structure he assumed had done the work. Think about that for a moment. He had been crediting a version of himself that in both cases wasn't actually the reason he'd won. This is the particular danger of success that arrives close together. It compounds the illusion. Two wins in a row feel like proof of mastery. They rarely are. More often, they're two different explanations wearing the same coincidence, and most people never separate them because separating them requires a kind of intellectual honesty that success actively discourages. The people who eventually build something lasting, a career, a reputation, a body of work that survives changing conditions, tend to develop an unusual relationship with their own wins. They enjoy them, they don't diminish them, but they also refuse to let a win close the investigation into how it happened. They hold two things at once: genuine satisfaction and genuine skepticism about their own explanation for that satisfaction. Most people see this as a kind of self-doubt. The most successful people see it as something else entirely, a form of respect for how complicated real outcomes actually are, and how rarely they come from the single clean cause we assign them after the fact. Marcus started keeping a different kind of record after that. Not a log of wins, but a log of reasons, his best honest guess, written down before the outcome was known, about why he thought a particular approach would work. Then afterward, he would go back and check. Had his reasoning actually predicted the result? Or had he simply gotten lucky and reverse-engineered a story that made him look sharper than he'd been? It was uncomfortable. Most useful habits are. But something began to shift in how he approached each new pitch, each new negotiation, each new room. He stopped assuming the last win explained the next one. He started treating every new attempt as its own case, with its own conditions, worthy of its own fresh attention. He didn't know it yet, but he was building the early architecture of a practice that would eventually define the second half of his career, one that had nothing to do with talent, and everything to do with a willingness to keep questioning a story that everyone else had already stopped questioning for him. There was a man Marcus worked alongside for years named David Okafor, and for a long time David was the person everyone pointed to when they wanted to describe what competence looked like. He'd built the reporting system their entire division still ran on. He knew the numbers cold. He could walk into any meeting and answer a question before it finished being asked. For a stretch of nearly 3 years, David was, by every visible measure, the most reliable person in the building. And then, slowly, without any single dramatic moment marking the shift, he stopped being that person. Not because he got worse, because everyone else got better, faster and quieter than he did. The system David built had been genuinely excellent when he built it, but he had built it once and then defended it for years, treating every suggestion to update it as a minor inconvenience rather than useful information. When newer, faster tools emerged, he dismissed them the way people often dismiss things that threaten a version of themselves they've grown comfortable being, not with hostility, with a kind of gentle, confident indifference that was, in its own way, far more dangerous. This is what almost nobody realizes about this. The moment you stop checking whether your methods still work is rarely a decision. It's an absence of a decision. Nobody wakes up and decides to stop questioning their own competence. They simply get busy or comfortable or both, and the checking quietly stops happening in the background while everything on the surface still looks fine. David didn't fail loudly. He faded. His work stayed technically correct while slowly becoming less and less relevant to what the business actually needed, and the gap between those two things widened so gradually that almost nobody noticed it happening in real time, including David himself. Ask yourself honestly, is there a skill you were once genuinely excellent at that you haven't actually tested against current conditions in longer than you'd like to admit? Most people carry at least one of these, a skill frozen at the exact level it reached during its most successful season, never updated, never re-examined, simply assumed to still be sharp because it once clearly was. The uncomfortable truth is that competence has an expiration date, and that date is almost never announced in advance. It expires quietly, while you're still operating as if it hasn't. The world moves, the tools change, the expectations shift. And unless you build a deliberate habit of checking your own relevance against the current landscape, rather than the landscape that existed when you were last evaluated, you end up exactly where David did, technically skilled and functionally behind. There is a particular kind of fear that drives people away from this kind of checking, and it's worth naming honestly. Reassessing your own competence means opening the door to the possibility that you've fallen behind. It means risking the discovery that the thing you're proud of, the thing that built your reputation, might no longer be enough. That's an uncomfortable thing to face voluntarily, and most people, quite understandably, avoid discomfort when nothing is forcing them to confront it. But here is the part that changes everything once you actually see it clearly. The discomfort of checking is temporary and controllable. The discomfort of discovering you've fallen behind after the fact, after a younger colleague gets the promotion, after the client chooses someone else, after the skill you built your identity around quietly stops mattering. That discomfort is neither temporary nor controllable. It arrives on someone else's timeline, usually publicly, usually at the worst possible moment. Marcus watched this happen to David over the better part of a year, and it left a mark on him that no success ever had. He began to understand that competence isn't a state you achieve and then hold on to. It's a moving target that requires continuous recalibration, and the people who stay sharp aren't necessarily the most talented people in the room. They're the ones willing to keep asking whether their talent still matches what the room currently needs. Think about that for a moment. Talent is a snapshot. Relevance is a practice. David eventually noticed the shift too, though later than everyone around him had. There was a meeting, Marcus remembered, where a junior analyst proposed a new approach to the exact system David had built years earlier, and David's first instinct was to defend it. His second instinct, a beat later, was something Marcus hadn't seen from him before, a flicker of genuine uncertainty, not about the system, about himself. That flicker mattered more than anything that had happened in the meeting itself. Because the people who eventually recover from a stretch of quiet decline are not the ones who never fall behind. Almost everyone falls behind eventually in something. The people who recover are the ones who notice the flicker of uncertainty and choose to sit with it instead of defending against it, who let that uncomfortable question in rather than closing the door on it out of pride. David didn't fix everything overnight. Nobody does. But he started asking a version of the same question Marcus had begun asking himself after the failed pitch. Not what worked before, but what's actually true now. That question, asked consistently and honestly, is the single quietest predictor of who keeps growing and who slowly, invisibly, stalls out at the exact height of their earlier success. And it raises a harder question underneath it, one that most people spend their entire careers avoiding. If your competence needs to be continuously rechecked, what does that mean for the identity you've built around it? There is a difference between a person who succeeded and a person whose identity became fused to that success, and most people never separate the two until something forces the distinction on them. Marcus began to see this difference clearly in the months after watching David's quiet decline. David hadn't just built a system, he had built a self around that system, a version of who he was that depended on the system remaining the most advanced thing in the room. When newer approaches emerged, David wasn't just defending a piece of software, he was defending an identity that had quietly, without his permission, become inseparable from a particular set of skills frozen in time. This is the trap that catches far more people than outright failure ever does. Failure is at least honest. It tells you clearly that something isn't working. Identity fusion is quieter and far more dangerous because it doesn't announce itself as a problem. It feels like confidence. It feels like knowing who you are, right up until who you are stops matching what the world actually needs from you. Here is what almost nobody realizes about this. Identity and momentum are not the same thing, even though they feel identical while you're inside a winning streak. Momentum is temporary. It's built from a specific set of conditions, a specific market, a specific season of your career, and it will eventually shift, because everything eventually shifts. Identity, if you let it, tries to make momentum permanent. It takes a temporary set of results and turns them into a fixed story about who you fundamentally are. Ask yourself honestly, how much of your confidence right now is built on conditions you actually control, and how much is built on a run of results that happen to align in your favor? Most people can't answer that question quickly, and that difficulty is itself the answer. It means some portion of their confidence is resting on ground they haven't actually tested. Marcus thought about his own career this way for the first time. He hadn't just closed a deal in Chicago. He had, somewhere in the weeks that followed, quietly started thinking of himself as a person who closes deals like that one. A permanent upgrade to his sense of who he was, built on a single data point that may or may not repeat. Think about that for a moment. A single win had rewritten his internal story about his own identity, and he hadn't even noticed the rewrite happening. This is where the distinction becomes genuinely useful rather than just philosophically interesting. A person whose confidence is built on identity, on a fixed story about who they are, tends to interpret challenges to that story as threats. A difficult pitch, a lost deal, a colleague's success, a shift in the market, all of these get filtered through the lens of what does this say about me? And that filter makes honest reassessment almost impossible. You cannot objectively examine a system when examining it feels like attacking yourself. A person whose confidence is built on process, on a continuously updated understanding of what currently works and why, experiences the exact same events completely differently. A lost deal isn't a referendum on their worth. It's information. A colleague's success isn't a threat to their identity, it's data about a changing landscape they can learn from. This isn't a difference in talent, it's a difference in what the self is actually built out of. Marcus started noticing this distinction in the highest performers he'd worked with over the years, the ones who seemed to weather change without ever losing their footing. What he came to notice was quiet, almost boring in its consistency. They talked about their own strengths the way a good mechanic talks about a car, with respect, but without ego. This part is running well right now. This part needs attention. This part I'm not sure about yet. Let's test it. There was no defensiveness in that language because there was nothing personal at stake in the diagnosis. The car wasn't who they were. It was something they were responsible for maintaining. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because the natural next question is whether this kind of separation, identity from momentum, self from strategy, actually requires giving up ambition or conviction. It doesn't. If anything, it requires more of both, aimed more precisely. The people who build the longest, most resilient careers are rarely the ones who care less about their success. They're the ones who've simply relocated where their sense of self actually lives. Not in the last outcome, not in the current streak, but in the process of continuously, honestly asking what's working, what isn't, and why, regardless of what that answer might cost their ego in the short term. Marcus began to picture what his own work might look like if he made that same relocation. Fewer defensive reactions to hard questions, less flinching when a pitch didn't land the way he expected. A kind of durability that didn't depend on every quarter going well, because his sense of who he was no longer lived inside any single quarter's results. It was a subtle shift, almost invisible from the outside. But it changed something fundamental in how he approached every conversation that followed, including the one with himself that would eventually give this entire practice its name. It started as a habit with no name. After the failed pitch, after watching David, after untangling his own confidence from the string of wins that had briefly convinced him he'd figured everything out, Marcus began doing something small on Sunday evenings. He would sit down with a notebook, no agenda, and ask himself one question about something in his work that was currently going well. Why is this actually working? Not the story he told colleagues, not the flattering version that made him look sharp in meetings, the real, unglamorous mechanics underneath a result he'd otherwise have no reason to examine because it wasn't broken. There is a behavior pattern that shows up in almost every person who eventually builds something that lasts. It is quiet. It is easy to overlook. And it looks nothing like what most people expect from someone at the top of their game. It isn't relentless hustle. It isn't constant reinvention for its own sake. It's this, a regular, almost mundane ritual of re-asking questions that already have comfortable answers. Most people only ask hard questions when something forces them to. A deal falls through, a relationship ends, a number drops. The question gets asked under duress, with the clock already running, and the answer arrives too late to actually change the outcome. This is reactive reassessment, and it is the default mode for almost everyone because it requires no discipline. Circumstances do the asking for you. But here is what almost nobody realizes about this. The reassessment that actually changes the trajectory of a career or a life is almost never the reactive kind. It's the kind that happens on purpose, on a schedule, during a season when nothing appears to require it. The kind that feels, in the moment, faintly ridiculous. Why interrogate something that's working? Marcus asked himself that exact question the first few times he sat down with his notebook. It felt like manufacturing a problem that didn't exist. But he kept going, mostly out of stubbornness, and what he found within a few months surprised him. Some of his assumptions held up under scrutiny. The relationship-building approach that had closed his second deal turned out to be genuinely sound, not luck. He could trace the mechanics of it clearly, and that gave him a kind of confidence that felt different from the confidence he'd had before. It wasn't borrowed from a good outcome. It was earned from actually understanding the outcome. But other assumptions didn't survive the process. A pitch structure he'd been using for over a year turned out to be working despite a weak middle section. Not because of it. Clients were staying engaged through sheer curiosity about where the numbers were headed, not because the argument itself was persuasive. He'd been getting away with a flaw, not avoiding one. Think about that for a moment. He would never have found that flaw by waiting for a client to reject him and explain why. Most clients don't explain why. They simply choose someone else, and you're left reconstructing the reason from fragments, usually incorrectly, usually too late to matter for that particular deal. This is the actual value of scheduled reassessment, and it's worth naming precisely because the value isn't emotional. It isn't about feeling virtuous or disciplined, though it can feel that way. The value is informational. You find the crack in the foundation while the building is still standing, while you still have the full luxury of time and resources to repair it properly, rather than discovering it during the exact moment the whole structure is under maximum stress. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely because the natural objection is obvious. Isn't this exhausting? Doesn't constantly questioning your own success eventually erode your confidence rather than build it? The answer, counterintuitively, runs the other direction. Confidence built on unexamined assumptions is fragile precisely because it's untested. It can be shattered by a single unexpected failure because the person holding it has never actually confirmed whether their success was earned or lucky. Confidence built through this kind of regular, honest reassessment is far sturdier because it has already survived its own scrutiny. It has nothing left to hide from. Marcus began to think of this ritual the way an engineer thinks about routine maintenance on a bridge that's carrying more traffic than ever. Nobody inspects a bridge because it's failing. They inspect it precisely because it's succeeding under load. Because success under load is exactly when hidden stress accumulates fastest and shows itself least. He didn't call it anything for a long time. It was just Sunday evenings, a notebook, and one uncomfortable question aimed at whatever part of his life currently looked the most solid. Ask yourself honestly, what part of your life currently looks the most solid, the most beyond question, the part you'd never think to examine precisely because it's going so well? That is very often exactly where the next hidden crack is forming, quietly, invisibly, underneath a surface that gives you no reason at all to look. There is a particular kind of blindness that only winning can produce. And it took Marcus almost a year of Sunday evenings to fully understand it. Early wins don't just build confidence. They build trust in a process, and that trust left unexamined becomes a filter through which every future decision gets made. The danger isn't that the process was wrong. Often it wasn't. The danger is that trust, once established, stops asking whether the process still fits the conditions it's currently operating in. Marcus found this most clearly when he looked back at the very deal that started all of this, Chicago. He had spent months believing his pitch structure had won that room. But when he finally traced the actual sequence of events with real honesty, a different picture emerged. The competitor bidding against him had suffered a public failure 2 weeks earlier, unrelated to Marcus entirely, and the client's urgency had shifted from cautious evaluation to fast decision-making almost overnight. Marcus had walked into a room where the bar had already been lowered by circumstances outside his control, and he'd credited himself entirely for clearing it. This is what almost nobody realizes about this. Winning hides its own causes better than losing does. When you lose, you're forced to investigate. The pain of the outcome demands an explanation. But when you win, the brain does something far lazier and far more dangerous. It simply accepts the most flattering available story and moves on because there's no discomfort pushing it to dig deeper. Ask yourself honestly, how many of your own biggest wins have you actually investigated with the same rigor you'd apply to a failure? For most people, the answer is close to none, and that asymmetry, repeated across a career, quietly builds a warped internal map. A map where your own skill is credited for outcomes that were substantially shaped by circumstances you never controlled and, worse, never even noticed. Think about that for a moment. This isn't a call for false modesty. It's not about diminishing genuine skill or pretending luck explains everything. It's about accuracy. Because a warped map, even a flattering one, leads you to make bad decisions in the future. Decisions based on a version of your own capability that was never entirely true. Marcus began applying the same rigor to his wins that he'd once only applied to his losses, and it changed something fundamental in how he prepared for new opportunities. Instead of asking what worked last time, he started asking a more precise, more uncomfortable question. What worked last time that I actually controlled versus what worked last time because conditions happened to favor me? That distinction turned out to matter enormously because only one half of it was repeatable. Most people see reassessing a win as a strange, almost self-defeating activity. Why interrogate success? The most successful people see it as something else entirely, the only reliable way to separate skill from circumstance, and therefore the only reliable way to know what to actually repeat. There's a story Marcus later told about a colleague, a woman named Priya Anand, who ran a small consulting practice and had built an enviable client retention rate over several years. Everyone assumed her retention numbers reflected her strategic advice. When she finally sat down and traced the actual pattern, she discovered something different. Her retention wasn't primarily driven by her strategic recommendations at all. It was driven by the speed and warmth of her communication. Clients stayed because she made them feel heard within hours, not days, regardless of how good the underlying advice actually was. This discovery didn't diminish her. It refined her. She stopped spending disproportionate energy perfecting strategic frameworks that clients barely noticed, and started deliberately protecting the responsiveness that had been quietly carrying her business the entire time. Her results improved, not because she worked harder, but because she finally understood what she was actually being trusted for. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because this kind of investigation only works if you're willing to tolerate an uncomfortable possibility going in, that the story you've told yourself about your own success might be partially or even substantially wrong. Most people protect that story instinctively, the same way they'd protect any other part of their identity. Admitting that circumstances did more work than skill can feel like a demotion. But it isn't a demotion, it's recalibration. And recalibration is the only path toward genuinely repeatable success, rather than success that quietly depends on conditions you have no way of guaranteeing twice. Marcus started to see his own career less as a string of proven victories and more as an ongoing experiment, one where each result, win or loss, was simply new evidence to be weighed, never final proof of anything permanent. That shift in framing would matter more than he realized, because the real test wasn't coming from another success. It was coming from a stretch of time where nothing for a while would go right at all. The stretch lasted 4 months, and Marcus would later call it the quietest crisis of his career, because nothing about it looked like a crisis from the outside. No single deal collapsed dramatically. No public failure marked the moment. Instead, results simply softened across the board. Smaller wins, slower closes, a steady erosion that was almost impossible to point to on any given week, but unmistakable when he looked at the full quarter laid out in front of him. This is the part of a career almost nobody prepares for, because it doesn't match the shape people expect failure to take. We're trained to brace for the dramatic collapse, the public mistake, the moment everyone can see. But real decline in a working life rarely arrives that way. It arrives as a slow flattening, a gradual dimming of results that's easy to explain away week by week. A slow market, a difficult client, bad timing, right up until the explanations stop adding up to anything believable. Marcus had spent nearly a year building the habit of reassessment during good seasons, and he assumed, somewhat naively, that this would make the difficult season easier. It didn't, at least not at first. Reassessing when things are going well is uncomfortable in an abstract intellectual way. Reassessing when things are actively falling apart is uncomfortable in a completely different, far more personal way, because every honest question now carries the risk of confirming your worst fear about yourself. Here is what almost nobody realizes about this. The habit built during good times isn't really designed to make bad times painless. It's designed to make bad times survivable without panic, because you've already practiced separating your identity from your results before the stakes got high enough to make that separation feel impossible. Marcus sat down with his notebook during the second month of the slump and asked the same question he'd been asking for a year. Why is this actually happening? Not the flattering version. not the excuse. The real mechanics underneath a result he desperately wished weren't true. What he found wasn't a single dramatic cause. It was several small accumulated shifts he hadn't tracked closely enough. A key competitor had quietly improved their onboarding process, closing a gap that used to work in Marcus's favor. Two of his best long-term client relationships had changed hands internally, replaced by newer decision-makers who didn't share the same history or trust that had once made his job easier. And the pitch structure he'd refined and re-refined over the previous year, the one he'd been so proud of untangling from luck, had started to feel, even to him, slightly stale, to rooms that had now heard some version of it before. Think about that for a moment. None of these were catastrophic on their own. Together, compounding quietly over months, they were enough to flatten a strong track record into a mediocre one. This is the cost of never reassessing, made visible in its full form. It isn't a single dramatic collapse. It's a slow accumulation of small, missed shifts, each one too minor to notice individually, each one entirely visible in hindsight, and each one avoidable if someone had been looking closely enough, early enough. Ask yourself honestly, how many small shifts are currently happening around your own work, quietly enough that you haven't noticed a single one of them yet? Nobody can answer that question with certainty. That's precisely the point. The value of ongoing reassessment isn't that it gives you perfect foresight, it's that it dramatically shortens the gap between a shift happening and you noticing it, which is the only real defense against this kind of slow erosion. Marcus's habit didn't save him from the slump. It was already underway by the time he identified its causes, but it did something almost as valuable. It gave him clarity fast enough to actually respond, rather than spending another 2 or 3 months confused about why his results kept softening. He rebuilt his pitch structure around the parts of his relationships that had genuinely proven durable, rather than the parts that had simply been convenient. He invested time in the newer decision-makers at his key accounts, treating the relationship as something that needed to be rebuilt rather than something he could coast on because of history. And he studied his competitors' improved onboarding process honestly, without the defensive dismissal that had cost David years earlier. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because the slump, once he understood its actual causes, stopped feeling like a personal failing and started feeling like exactly what it was. Outdated information finally catching up to him. The people who recover fastest from stretches like this are rarely the most talented in the room. They're the ones who've built the habit of looking honestly at their own results long before a slump forces the looking to happen under pressure. Marcus came out the other side of those 4 months slower to celebrate any single win and slower to panic over any single loss. Both, he now understood, were simply information, and information, unlike identity, could always be updated. There is a specific kind of discipline that almost nobody practices because almost nothing forces them to, and it separates the people who merely recover from a slump from the people who never let a slump reach dangerous depth in the first place. It's the discipline of rebuilding something while it still technically works. Marcus noticed this most clearly once he'd stabilized after those 4 difficult months. His instinct, like most people's, had been to treat the recovery itself as the finish line. Results improved. Deals started closing at a healthier pace again. The natural temptation was to exhale, credit the fixes he'd made, and quietly return to the same rhythm of trust he'd fallen into before, the very rhythm that had let small shifts accumulate unnoticed in the first place. But here is what almost nobody realizes about this. The moment right after a recovery is one of the most dangerous moments in any career, precisely because it feels like safety. The system works again, the pressure is off, and that relief creates exactly the same conditions that allowed the original decline to go unnoticed for months. Comfort returns, and with it, the temptation to stop looking closely. Marcus decided, almost as an experiment, to do something that felt genuinely strange the first time he tried it. He picked the part of his current process that was working best, not the parts that had failed during the slump, but the parts performing at their strongest right now, and he began systematically stress-testing it long before anything suggested it needed attention. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever deliberately examined the part of your life or work that's currently performing best, specifically because it's performing best? Almost nobody does this naturally. It runs against every instinct. If something isn't broken, the instinct is to leave it alone and direct your energy toward whatever is currently struggling. But this instinct, reasonable as it feels, quietly guarantees that today's strongest asset becomes tomorrow's blind spot, simply because it's the one thing nobody is watching closely. Think about that for a moment. The parts of your life that feel most secure right now are, by definition, the parts you're least likely to be questioning. And the parts you're least likely to be questioning are exactly the parts most capable of quietly decaying without your notice. This is the essence of rebuilding while nothing is broken, and it requires a genuinely different relationship with effort than most people are used to. Most effort is reactive. Something breaks, and you fix it. This kind of effort is proactive in a way that offers no immediate reward, no visible crisis to justify the energy spent, no gratitude from anyone watching, because from the outside, nothing appears to require attention at all. Marcus began applying this to the client relationships that were currently strongest, the ones that felt the most secure, the ones he would have once assumed needed the least attention. He reached out, not with a sales pitch, but with genuine curiosity about how their needs might be shifting, about what might be changing on their end that he hadn't asked about in months. Some conversations confirmed that nothing had changed and that reassurance itself was valuable. Others revealed early signs of the exact kind of quiet drift that had cost him during the slump. Shifting priorities, new internal pressures, subtle dissatisfactions nobody had thought worth mentioning because nobody had asked. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because this proactive rebuilding doesn't just prevent future decline. It compounds. Every relationship, every system, every skill maintained this way stays sharper for longer, requires less dramatic repair later, and creates a kind of quiet durability that reactive maintenance can never fully replicate. There is a particular image worth holding on to here, one Marcus returned to often in the months that followed. Picture your career, or your business, or your closest relationships, 5 years from now, built by someone who never waited for a crack to appear before addressing it, not someone paranoid or anxious, constantly bracing for disaster, someone calm, curious, and quietly attentive, treating maintenance not as a response to failure, but as an ordinary, permanent part of how they operate. That person's foundation looks different from someone who only repairs damage after it's visible. It looks less dramatic, less impressive in any single moment, and dramatically more solid over time. Most people see proactive maintenance as unnecessary effort spent on something that isn't asking for it. The most successful people see it as something else entirely, the only real form of insurance against the kind of slow, invisible decline that eventually catches almost everyone who assumes today's strength guarantees tomorrow's. Marcus started to notice something else too, something he hadn't expected when he began this practice. The people around him who operated this way, who maintained strength before it was tested, carried a particular kind of calm that was different from confidence built on a winning streak. It wasn't the calm of someone who believed nothing could go wrong. It was the calm of someone who had already looked closely at everything that could and had addressed what needed addressing, long before anyone forced them to. There was a woman Marcus met at a conference 2 years into this practice, a long-time operations executive named Eleanor Kowalski, and within 20 minutes of talking to her, he recognized something familiar. The same quiet, almost boring discipline He'd been building on his own Sunday evenings, except she'd clearly been practicing it for decades. What struck him most wasn't anything she said about strategy or leadership. It was a small detail she mentioned in passing. Every quarter, regardless of how the numbers looked, she scheduled a half day entirely alone, with no agenda beyond one question. What am I currently assuming that I haven't actually verified in the last 3 months? She'd been doing this for 11 years, not during crises, not during slumps, during ordinary quarters, good and bad alike, treated with exactly the same seriousness. This is what almost nobody realizes about this. The people who sustain long careers rarely think of reassessment as an occasional emergency response. They think of it the way most people think of brushing their teeth: unremarkable, non-negotiable. Something you do regardless of how healthy things currently feel, precisely because waiting for a problem to appear defeats the entire purpose of prevention. Elena described her quarterly ritual with a kind of matter-of-fact plainness that Marcus found almost disarming. There was no drama in how she talked about it, no language of breakthroughs or transformation, just a simple, repeated habit, practiced with the same regularity as any other piece of infrastructure she maintained. Ask yourself honestly, is there a single habit in your life related to growth or reassessment that you've maintained consistently for more than a year, regardless of how things were going at the time? For most people, even ambitious, disciplined people, the honest answer is no. Most reassessment happens in bursts, triggered by pain, abandoned once the pain subsides. What made Elena different wasn't intelligence or even discipline in the way most people imagine it. It was consistency stripped of emotional dependency. She reassessed exactly as diligently during her best quarters as her worst, because the practice had never been tied to how she felt about her current results in the first place. Think about that for a moment. Most self-improvement fails not from lack of insight, but from insight arriving only when things are already painful enough to force it. And by then, the insight arrives too late to prevent the damage it identifies. Marcus began to notice this same quiet consistency in nearly everyone he met who had sustained real success over long stretches of time across wildly different fields. A surgeon who reviewed his own outcomes data every month, regardless of how his patients were doing. A teacher who rewrote her lesson plans every year, even when student results were strong, specifically because she didn't trust that what worked for one group of students would automatically work for the next. A retired athlete who described, almost sheepishly, a habit of refilming and critiquing his own technique long after he'd already become the best in his league. Not because anything was wrong, but because he refused to assume nothing eventually would be. None of these people described their habit as impressive. All of them described it as ordinary, almost dull, a simple structural feature of how they operated rather than a special insight they were proud of. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive part of the entire practice, and it's worth sitting with directly. The people who benefit most from reassessment are the ones who've stopped treating it as a special event and started treating it as background infrastructure, as unremarkable and automatic as checking the mirrors while driving. Not a reaction to danger, simply part of how they move through the world, regardless of whether danger currently appears to be present. Most people see this kind of relentless self-checking as exhausting, even paranoid. The most successful people see it as something else entirely, the quietest, least glamorous form of respect they can offer their own future, paid consistently in advance, long before any crisis demands it. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because once reassessment becomes infrastructure rather than event, something shifts in how a person relates to uncertainty itself. Change stops feeling like a threat to be defended against and starts feeling like simply the next input to be examined. The same way Elena examined every quarter, the same way Marcus had slowly, imperfectly learned to examine his own wins and losses, without flinching from either. Marcus left that conference with a clearer sense of what the last 2 years had actually been building toward. Not a single insight, not a single fix. A permanent shift in how closely and how honestly he was willing to look at his own life, on a schedule that had nothing to do with whether looking felt urgent or comfortable at the time. He was beginning to understand that this practice wasn't a phase he would eventually graduate from once his career stabilized. It was the thing that would keep it stable, indefinitely, for as long as he was willing to keep doing it. 5 years after Chicago, Marcus sat in a different conference room, in a different city, waiting on a different client's decision. The room felt almost identical to that first one, the same tension in the air, the same practiced calm on his own face. But he noticed, sitting there, that something fundamental about him had changed in ways that had nothing to do with skill or experience alone. He no longer needed this particular deal to mean anything about who he was. That distinction, small as it sounds, was the entire outcome of everything that had happened since that first cold October afternoon. Not a bigger title, not a longer client list. A quieter, more durable relationship with his own results, built one uncomfortable Sunday evening at a time. This is what almost nobody realizes about this. The goal was never to stop caring about outcomes. Marcus cared about this deal, sitting in that room, every bit as much as he'd cared about Chicago 5 years earlier. What had changed was where his sense of self lived, while he waited for the answer. It no longer lived inside the verdict. It lived inside the process that had gotten him to the room in the first place. A process he trusted precisely because he'd spent 5 years continuously checking whether it still deserved that trust. The client said yes, eventually, after a pause that once would have made his stomach drop. This time, Marcus simply felt satisfaction, clean and uncomplicated, without the undertow of relief that used to follow every win. The relief of someone who'd been secretly afraid the whole thing might have been luck all along. Think about that for a moment. The absence of that fear was, in its own quiet way, the entire reward of 5 years of deliberate reassessment. What comes next changes how most people think about this entirely, because the natural assumption is that a life built around constant reassessment would feel unstable. A person perpetually questioning themselves, never settled, never at peace. The opposite turned out to be true. The instability Marcus remembered most vividly wasn't from the years he spent questioning his own success. It was from the earlier years, when he'd built his confidence on unexamined wins and discovered again and again just how quickly that kind of confidence could collapse the moment reality stopped cooperating with the story he'd told himself. Real stability, it turned out, wasn't the absence of uncertainty. It was a practiced, familiar relationship with uncertainty, the confidence that came not from believing nothing would ever go wrong, but from knowing he would notice quickly if something did, and that noticing quickly was, in the end, almost the entire game. Marcus thought often about David during those years, and about what had ultimately become of him. David had eventually done the harder work too, later than most. But not too late. He'd rebuilt the system he'd once defended so rigidly, and he'd done it with a humility that hadn't existed in him before the fall. Marcus thought about Elena's quarterly ritual, still running, presumably, somewhere in another city, unremarkable and relentless. He thought about Priya, who had stopped mistaking her strategic frameworks for the real source of her client loyalty, and had built something sturdier once she understood what her clients had actually been trusting her for all along. None of these people had anything unusual in common except one habit, practiced consistently without fanfare, regardless of how well things currently appeared to be going. Ask yourself honestly, what would change in your own life if you stopped waiting for a crisis to justify asking hard questions about the things that currently look fine? That question doesn't have a dramatic answer. It has a quiet one. Nothing about it looks impressive from the outside. Nobody applauds a person for reassessing a relationship that isn't in trouble, or a skill that isn't yet obsolete, or a strategy that hasn't yet failed. There's no visible reward for maintenance performed before anything breaks. That absence of applause is exactly why so few people ever build the habit, and exactly why the people who do build it end up, over enough years, standing so far apart from everyone who didn't. Marcus walked out of that final conference room and back into the ordinary rhythm of his week. Emails, meetings, the next pitch already forming somewhere down the calendar. Nothing about the moment looked historic. It wasn't supposed to. The real work had never been in any single room, any single deal, any single dramatic turning point. It had been in 5 years of Sunday evenings, and it would continue to be for as long as he kept showing up to them. Not because anything was currently broken, but because nothing currently being broken was never in itself a reason to stop looking closely. That was the entire ritual, stripped down to its simplest form. Not a technique, not a system with 10 steps and a certificate at the end. Just a willingness, renewed consistently, to ask what's actually true right now, especially when everything currently suggests there's no reason to ask at all. Because the people who build something that lasts are rarely the ones who never face uncertainty. They're simply the ones who never stop checking for it, especially in the exact moments when checking felt, to everyone else, completely unnecessary. There is a particular kind of person who has stopped mistaking a good season for a finished story. And Marcus, 5 years and 1 quiet ritual later, had finally become one of them. Somewhere out there is a version of you standing exactly where Marcus once stood, in a moment that feels finished, a win that feels permanent, a season so good it seems almost rude to question it. This is not a warning against that feeling. Enjoy it fully. It's earned, and it's real. But hold it the way Marcus eventually learned to hold his own success, with open hands rather than a closed fist. Let it be true today, without demanding that it explain everything about tomorrow. The world underneath even your best results is quietly shifting, the way it always has, the way it always will, whether or not you're watching. You don't need to watch anxiously, you simply need to watch consistently. A single honest question, asked on an ordinary evening when nothing appears to be wrong, is worth more than 100 urgent questions asked after something finally breaks. Somewhere ahead of you is a version of yourself who kept looking closely long after it stopped feeling necessary, who treated calm seasons not as permission to stop paying attention, but as the safest, quietest opportunity to pay the closest attention of all. That version of you isn't louder than the one you are right now, isn't more talented or luckier or spared from the ordinary difficulties everyone eventually faces. That version of you simply never mistook a good chapter for the whole book. Carry that with you the next time everything looks fine, especially then.